Good morning. I was speaking briefly with Bishop Capellare before our session this morning, and he indicated that it is important to him that at this meeting there be some specifically Catholic content. So let me begin this morning with something eminently Catholic, and that is a confession. I'm going to confess 4 sins to this group. First, the sin of not speaking German. I apologize for that. You are going to have to make do with my coarse English. Secondly, and this apology is directed mostly at our translators, the sin of not having a prepared text. I know that makes your life more difficult, but the good news is there will not be any complicated citations or quotations because that would presume that I knew anything. So we don't have to worry about that. Third, an apology for the sin of often speaking too fast. I'm going to try to control myself, but I spend a lot of time working in network television in the United States where you get about 90 seconds and you're paid by the syllable. So there's always an emphasis on talking fast. I will try not to do that here this morning. And then third, and this isn't so much my sin, it's really a sin, fourth, it's really a sin on the part of the conference organizers. But I fear that I have been presented to you as an expert on religion. This really is not true. What I am is a journalist who covers the Catholic Church, and more specifically, the Vatican and the papacy. And so I will be speaking this morning largely out of that perspective, trying to talk about some trajectories I see in the relationship between the church in Europe and the church in the United States. And perhaps that will open up some vistas for the provocative question that was put to us at the beginning as to whether religion is part of the problem or part of the solution. Okay? Let me begin with a fairly counterintuitive thesis. Okay? We live in a moment in which relations between the United States and Europe politically seem to be falling apart. Okay? Just last night at 9 p.m., shortly after 9 p.m. our time here, the President of the United States announced that the United States will be abandoning the Paris Climate Change Accord, which is strongly supported by the vast majority of European governments. And if you look at the reaction that the major European powers have issued this morning to that announcement, it is clear that this is opening a new flashpoint in transatlantic relationships. This is on top of course, the recent G7 meeting, where although we don't exactly know what went on behind closed doors between President Trump and Chancellor Merkel of Germany, as a footnote, I suggested they should have turned that into a live global pay-per-view event. I think people around the world would have paid $50 to see that meeting, and they could have retired the deficit of the G7 in one day, but no one listens to me. In any event, we don't quite know what went on in that meeting, but we do know that in the aftermath, Chancellor Merkel announced that Europe can no longer count on the United States and Great Britain in the way it has in the past, and that Europeans now must take their destiny in their own hands. In effect, it was a European Declaration of Independence. President Trump, of course, was elected on an America First mandate, which does not seem to augur particularly well for international cooperation on a variety of fronts. Great Britain, through the Brexit referendum, has already voted formally to abandon the European Union, and on and on. In other words, on the political level, it would be very difficult to make a case for robust optimism right now about the immediate short-term future of relations between the United States and Europe. What I want to suggest to you, however, is that in the ecclesiastical realm, that is, in terms of the Catholic Church, the opposite is the case. we are living through a period of warming relations between the United States and Europe, increasing sense of common cause, and increasing collaboration on multiple fronts. And when I say the church in this case, I am talking largely about the leadership class of the church, that is, the bishops, although, of course, the initiatives and priorities of the bishops are shared by a wide swath of other actors in the church as well. Okay? Let me give you three fronts, three issues, where I see this kind of growing détente, this growing sense of common purpose and common cause among the hierarchies of Europe and the United States. The first is anti-Christian persecution, especially in the Middle East. Now, when we say anti-Christian persecution, that of course is merely one form of a broader problem of religious violence. And certainly no responsible Catholic leader would ever suggest that we should be concerned only with the persecution of Christians. We should be concerned about religious discrimination in all its forms and no matter who its targets may be. That said, there is a case at the moment for a special focus on anti-Christian persecution. One, because uniquely among the world's persecuted groups, persecuted Christians often struggle to get their stories told. There is often a wall of silence around the scope and scale of the problem. Let me just give you a couple of very basic statistics. According to Open Doors International, which is an advocacy group, a watchdog group, that is sort of an observatory on anti-Christian persecution, there are 200 million Christians in the world today. That's 200 million. Who are every day exposed to the threat of arrest, torture, detention, physical harassment, and ultimately death. Here's another statistic. In terms of the number of new Christian martyrs each year, we have two estimates. One comes from the Center for the Study of Global Christianity, which is in Connecticut in the United States, which estimates that each year for the last decade, 100,000 Christians annually have been killed for motives linked to their faith. That's 100,000. That's the high-end estimate. The low-end estimate comes to us from the former chair of the World Council of Churches, based in Geneva, who believes that a more realistic estimate is that there are something like 7,000 to 8,000 new Christian martyrs every year. So we're talking about a range between 100,000 to 7,000 or 8,000. What that works out to is there is either one new Christian martyr every 5 minutes, or there is one new Christian martyr every hour of every day, 365 days a year. It is, in any event, whichever estimate is closer to the truth, it is a human rights scourge of staggering proportions. Now, that reality, the reality of the suffering church in our time, is one that has been familiar for anyone who wanted to look for a long time. However, it has become clear to the eyes of the world, of course, because of the rise of ISIS in the Middle East, particularly in Syria and Iraq, and the genocidal campaign that ISIS has unleashed against the religious minorities of the territories under their control, in particular Christians, but also, of course, Yazidis and Alawites and others. Now, in the not-so-distant past, I would say over the last 20 or 30 years, the bishops of both Europe and the United States have always had a particular interest in the Christians of the Middle East. Like Islam and Judaism, Christianity was born in the Middle East. The presence of Christianity in what we call the Holy Land is both a historical and a spiritual pipeline to the very origins of Christianity. So for all kinds of reasons, the bishops of both Europe and the United States have long been invested in trying to assist the church there. However, the politics of the situation often made collaboration between European Catholic entities and American Catholic entities a bit problematic. Because prior to the rise of ISIS, when you were to say Christians in the Middle East, in general you'd be thinking about the Christians of Israel and Palestine, right? And the political reality is that for a good stretch of time, the typical Catholic bishop in the United States, in terms of his instincts and his sympathies, would likely be pro-Israeli. Whereas the typical Catholic bishop in Europe, and again, there are many exceptions, we're talking in generalities, but the typical Catholic bishop in Europe would likely, in terms of his instincts and sympathies, be a bit more pro-Palestinian. So that when American bishops would talk about persecuted Christians in the Middle East, they often wanted to talk about Christians on the West Bank and the Gaza Strip who were suffering from the rise of Hamas. When European bishops wanted to talk about persecuted Christians in the Middle East, they would talk about the Arab Christian minority in Israel and the way it suffers a sort of permanent second-class citizenship, often not so much for being Christian, but for being Arab. And that often got in the way of cooperation and common cause because often there would be differences in perspectives, agenda, and priorities. And the functional reality was often that the Americans would do their thing, the Europeans would do their things. Where they could intersect, they would, but they were generally different animals. We are in a different situation today because, of course, the focus has shifted to some extent from the Holy Land proper to Syria and Iraq. And in broad strokes, Catholic bishops in both the United States and in Europe would share the same political diagnosis of that situation. That is to say, both would be convinced that ISIS is a real and present danger. Both would be convinced that defending religious freedom, and in particular providing greater protection for Christians in those countries, ought to be a major foreign policy priority of the West. And both would be deeply skeptical about the use of force to achieve regime change in those societies, particularly about proposals to use American or Western military resources to try to bring down the regime of Bashar al-Assad in Syria. This is not because Catholic bishops, either in the United States or Europe, or for that matter the Middle East, are under any illusions about the angelic character of Bashar al-Assad. They're not. They know he is a thug and a bully and that he is running a police state. What they would insist is that recent experience teaches us that the aftermath of the fall of a police state in the Middle East often is not thriving democracy. Often it is social, political, economic chaos in which Christians in particular are disadvantaged. And Iraq, obviously, there would be the main object lesson. So, in other words, I think there is now a shared sense of purpose among the bishops of the United States and Europe about where energy ought to be invested in the Middle East, about what ought to be done about it. They are, in that regard, very much in lockstep with the Vatican and the present Pope, Pope Francis, who has spoken repeatedly about the plight of Christians in the Middle East and called upon churches around the world to mobilize their resources to come to their aid. So I think this is a front increasingly in which the hierarchies of Europe and the United States are no longer divided, they are united. I think there is a much greater sense of the possibilities for partnership and sharing resources there. And if you are looking to spot an emerging megatrend in Catholic life, this is certainly one of them. The struggle to preserve the spiritual legacy of Christianity in the Holy Land, and to make sure that the Holy Land does not become what Cardinal Jean-Louis Tauran, the Vatican's former top diplomat, once described as a spiritual Disneyland. That is a kind of theme park full of attractions but empty of flesh and blood living Christians. I think that is an emerging priority for the global church and also for the churches of our two continents. Second issue where I think you can see the leadership of the Catholic Church in Europe and the United States growing together today is immigration. Again, let's roll the clock back 20 or 30 years. Okay, the height of the John Paul II years in the Catholic Church. If you were to ask the more conservative bishops in Europe, okay, and I'm thinking in that time of figures such as Cardinal Meissner of Cologne, Cardinal Caffarra of Bologna, Cardinal Ruini of Rome, and any number of others. If you were to ask the conservative Catholic bishops of Europe, what do you make of immigration? Generally, the answer you would get would range from ambivalence to outright opposition. And the reason was, at that point in time, the form of immigration that was dominating public debate in Europe was largely from Islamic societies. Most of the new arrivals were Muslim. And some of the conservative leaders of the Catholic Church in Europe saw that form of immigration as a threat to the Christian identity of Europe. Famously, Cardinal Caffarra called upon European societies to give preferential treatment to migrants and refugees coming from predominantly Catholic cultures on the grounds that that was a necessary measure to preserve the spiritual and religious identity of Europe. Meanwhile, even the most conservative bishops in the United States 20 or 30 years ago would not have been anti-immigrant. In fact, many of them were among the most strongly outspoken pro-immigrant voices in the country. And that too is for a fairly simple reason, which is the immigrants coming into the United States were coming from Mexico and Central America. They were overwhelmingly Christian and overwhelmingly Catholic. And they were bringing with them much higher levels of faith and practice than the existing Catholic population in the country. I mean, it is a fact in the United States, according to the Pew Forum Religious Landscape Study in America, that today, 1 in every 10 adult Americans is a former Catholic. That is, someone who was born Catholic but who later left the practice of the faith. 1 in 10. Former Catholics would be the second largest religious denomination in the country, if they thought of themselves as a denomination. The Catholic Church would have been losing its percentage share of the American population for the last 50 years. That is, 50 years ago, we were 25% of the or the overall population in America. Today, we would be about 12 or 13%, were it not for immigration. Immigration has kept us level at 25%. So, for very basic pastoral reasons, our bishops, even 20 or 30 years ago, were very strongly pro-immigrant, strongly inclined to take positions in favor of immigrant rights, to make stands against crackdowns on immigrants, and so on. For the very simple pastoral reason that these are their people. These are the people they see when they are in parishes and at diocesan events, when they go to congresses put on by the movements, and they go to novenas and First Fridays. I mean, that's what they see. You know, the Catholic Church in the United States was born in the 19th century as a blue-collar immigrant church. And in many ways, we have a back-to-the-future dynamic today. We're going back to precisely that identity. Our bishops know that, and so there really was no left-right divide among the American bishops on this particular issue, whereas to some extent there was in Europe. Today, that is really no longer the case. I would say in general, with a few exceptions, but in general, the European episcopacy is much closer to the American today in this regard, in that you have a strong center of gravity that would be politically read as pro-immigrant. That is for a couple of reasons, I think. One is the nature of immigration in Europe has shifted. Yes, there still is a steady stream of Muslim immigrants, but those are hardly the only ones. In many European societies today, you find flourishing Filipino diasporas, for instance. You find large pockets of Africans in those huge Congolese communities in France, for instance, large Nigerian communities in Germany. And many of those folks are Christian, and many of them are Catholic. And it would be a rare bishop anywhere in Europe today who wouldn't tell you that some of the most dynamic Catholic life he sees is going on within those immigrant and refugee communities. It is telling, I think, that 2 days ago, a colleague and I had the opportunity to interview your cardinal, Cardinal Christoph Schönborn of Vienna. And towards the end, we asked him for his diagnosis of the state of the faith in Europe, and specifically where he sees signs of hope for the faith in Europe. And the very first thing he mentioned are precisely these immigrant populations. He was making the point that it is impossible for him to go anywhere in Europe these days and dip into church life where you won't find dynamic, flourishing, upbeat, excited, faith-filled, lively, happening immigrant communities, sort of injecting adrenaline into the Catholic bloodstream. And so I think that has given many European bishops a different perspective. The other thing, I think, that has recalibrated the Catholic discussion is quite obviously the leadership of Pope Francis on this issue. I think in many ways Pope Francis may well be remembered as the immigrant pope. Remember that Pope Francis is himself the child of immigrants. His family hails from the Piedmont region of northern Italy, and in the early 20th century set sail to make a new life in Argentina. Argentina is largely a society of immigrants, so he has grown up with this cause sort of in his DNA, and clearly made a conscious strategic decision from the very first moments of his papacy, even though he is concerned with many things, to give a special pride of place to this issue. Many people think that the first foreign trip, or the first trip outside of Rome that Pope Francis took was to go to Brazil in July of 2013 to celebrate World Youth Day. That's not correct. The very first but the very first trip Pope Francis took outside of Rome came in June 2013, just about 2 months after his election, when he traveled to the island of Lampedusa, which of course immediately resonates in European ears. I always have to explain this to Americans, but it is the primary point of arrival for many migrants and refugees trying to get into Europe from either the Middle East or Northern Africa. There is a massive refugee detention center there. It is also a harrowing reminder of the human suffering that is embedded in the contemporary refugee crisis and migrant crisis. The estimate is that in the last decade alone, some 20,000 people have died in the Mediterranean Sea trying to make the crossing to Lampedusa in these rickety, overcrowded, unsafe, and illegal boats. Pope Francis went there to lay a wreath in the sea to commemorate the victims. And it was where, for the first time, he rolled out this rhetorical trope that has since become one of the centerpieces of his papacy, which is the contrast between what he calls a throwaway culture, that is a culture in which whole categories of humanity are regarded as essentially disposable, and a culture of welcome and encounter, clearly calling the world to move ever more towards the latter. That was a signal. Popes, particularly for the very first things they do, they know that sets a tone. It creates an agenda. That trip, that one-day stop in Lampedusa, was, in effect, an entire program of governance in miniature. What it told us was that Pope Francis was going to invest the resources of his bully pulpit in raising consciousness and mobilizing the church, and ideally the world, around this issue. And he has, of course, gone on to follow through with that in multiple ways. When he visited the Greek island of Lesbos last year in the company of Patriarch Bartholomew of Constantinople, the Holy Father famously brought several Syrian refugees who were being detained in that center on the papal plane with him back to Rome and settled them in Vatican-owned properties with the assistance of the community of Sant'Egidio, and he has subsequently done that on other occasions. I think something analogous is happening in the Catholic Church today to what happened with ecumenism and interfaith dialogue under Pope John Paul II, now Saint John Paul II. Of course, many Catholic bishops were involved in ecumenical work or in dialogue with other religions before John Paul came along. But John Paul put such an emphasis on that, famously convening these interreligious assemblies in Assisi, the first one taking place in 1986, routinely meeting with other Christian leaders and other religious leaders on his trips abroad, his 104 trips abroad, and routinely receiving them in the Vatican, that what happened is that ecumenism and interfaith dialogue went from being optional for a Catholic bishop to being mandatory. Prior to John Paul, if a bishop weren't engaged in those activities, nobody was going to ask him why. Post John Paul II, if a bishop is going to decline to engage in those activities, people will demand an explanation. Because the example of John Paul was simply so strong that it created a culture in the church in which this became seen as obligatory and simply part of the job description of what it means to be a Catholic bishop. I think something similar today is going on with compassion and concern for migrants and refugees. Again, many bishops were involved in these issues well before Pope Francis came along. But again, his example, his insistence, has been so strong, I think it is now becoming seen as obligatory. For example, in the old days being 30 years ago, if a Catholic bishop declined to open church properties that were being unused in order to offer hospitality to refugees, no one would have demanded an explanation. It would have been seen as his call. Today, if a bishop were to do that, you can bet people would demand an explanation, and the question would begin with, why can't you be more like the Pope? Okay? So the calculus in Catholicism is different today because of the impress and the example of Pope Francis. And this, again, is something that I believe the bishops of Europe and the United States have in common. So increasingly, their positions and their priorities on immigration will not drive them apart, it will bring them together. Okay. And third area where I see growing convergence between the leadership of the church in Europe and in the United States would be on the issue of conscientious objection. Conscientious objection. Here's the thing. Probably the defining difference between Catholicism in the United States and Catholicism in Europe over the last 30 or 40 years has been, in the United States, we are still fighting the culture wars. Okay? That is, legendarily, the litmus test for Catholic identity in the United States over that span of time has been the struggle against abortion, which is in many ways a struggle that is not as characteristic of most, particularly Western European societies, because from the point of view of the civil law, that's been a settled question in most Western European societies for some time. To a lesser extent, it's been the struggle against gay marriage and against contraception and against euthanasia. Those became the focal point for the bishops of the United States, largely because they were questions being asked by the culture. Okay? Abortion was being debated intensely in our culture. Same-sex marriage was being debated intensely in our culture, euthanasia, and so on. To a great extent, that is no longer the case. You know, on the abortion front, I think there is now a clear consensus, left, right, and center in the United States, that the fundamental reality of the 1973 Roe v. Wade decision that legalized abortion in the United States with certain conditions, the fundamental reality of that is not going to shift. We are not going to return to a time in which abortion is criminalized in America. We will debate limits and we will debate things like parental notification laws. We'll debate whether abortion should be publicly funded or part of publicly provided health care programs. But the fundamental reality of the legalization of abortion is not going to change, and pretty much anyone who's paying attention knows that. In the wake of the Obergefell decision by the U.S. Supreme Court a few months ago, same-sex marriage is now the law of the land in all 50 states. And although the incoming Trump administration has made some noise about trying to roll that back, it seems politically unlikely. We have several American states that have approved euthanasia measures. Others seem to be preparing to do so. In other words, in terms of the civil law of the United States, increasingly the landscape in the United States on these very contentious social questions, the landscape is increasingly coming to resemble that of most Western European societies. That is, the secular consensus that these matters ought to be left to personal choice rather than being dictated by the state appears to be taking hold in the United States the same way, to a great extent, it has here. Which means our bishops, for the most part, are no longer going to be fighting the culture wars in the classic sense. Okay, because the culture wars won't be around to fight. Okay? I think the new frontier in terms of the political and social advocacy on these issues is going to be one that is very familiar to Catholics in Europe, and that is the issue of conscientious objection. Okay, granted, the state has made the decision, take abortion, the state has made the decision to legalize abortion. To what extent will faith communities be obliged to be complicit in that? For instance, if you're running a Catholic hospital, will the state compel you to offer abortion services, abortifacient drugs? If you are an employer, a Catholic employer, and you provide insurance to your employees, will you be obligated to provide coverage of these services? And if you are, what are the consequences for civil disobedience? Okay, those are issues that, as I say, Catholic thinkers and activists and leaders in Europe have been trying to get their minds around for some time. What the proper limits there are between our obligations as citizens and our obligations as people of faith, that is a notoriously difficult balance to strike. But it's one, I think, that Catholicism in Europe has a great deal of experience and reflection. And increasingly, I think the Catholic leadership class in the United States will be looking to draw upon it. So, in conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, I guess my point is this, that if you look around the Catholic landscape today, we are in this sort of counterintuitive and countercultural moment in which, while our political leaders seem to be driving us apart, in many ways, our ecclesiastical leaders are striving to bring us ever closer together. And in a time of disintegration, a time of raging populism, a time of fraying ties of friendship, I would suggest that there is at least some encouragement that can be found in that fact. Thank you very much. So how do you want to do this?
So after this great speech by you, there's some minutes left for questions. So who will have the second question?
Well, who had the first?
Yeah.
There's a hand up.
Okay.
Good morning. Thanks for that very interesting presentation. One question, a notion I know from the early 20th century and 19th century is that Catholicism in the United States has been seen very critical by the Protestant majority because Catholics accept the Pope, higher as the Constitution and the government. Is this still a topic in larger parts of the population or only on the political fringe?
Well, there are, 300 million people in the United States, so it's very difficult to speak in generalities. But there certainly are pockets. Well, first of all, let me just repeat the premise of the question. The premise of the question is, in the 19th century, Catholics in America were often looked upon with suspicion by the Protestant majority because the question was, are your loyalties to the country or to the Pope, right, to put it in its most basic form. And the question is that still a live concern today? You can find some pockets of deeply conservative evangelical Protestantism where that rhetoric will still circulate. But I don't think it really drives political or social life. Now, is that good news? Well, yes and no, okay? The yes part is it means that America has, over time, gradually become, and at times grudgingly, much more welcoming of religious diversity, much more comfortable with it, and that is, of course, a positive thing. The no, however, is that part of the reason that Catholics in public life are no longer perceived as threatening to anyone is because at times they are only ambiguously Catholic. That is to say, they may have been baptized Catholic, they may even occasionally go to church, but there's often precious little evidence that their faith convictions genuinely drive their roles as citizens or as political leaders. And I think that's true on the right and the left. You've got a lot of conservative Catholic politicians in the States, who will talk a great game about the life issues and about opposition to abortion and so on, but then you look at their political and even their private lives, and there doesn't seem to be a great deal of evidence that the faith matters that much. And the same thing is true on the left. So I think, in other words, I suppose part of the reason that people are no longer threatened by the Catholicity of a political leader is because we have too many political leaders for whom their Catholicity doesn't seem to matter. So it's a mixed bag, but in any event, no, there would be absolutely no bar, for instance, to a Catholic being elected president of the United States today. Frankly, I doubt the question of his or her religious affiliation would even come up. When John Kerry was nominated in 2004, he came within a few thousand votes of becoming president of the United States. And the reason he lost was not because he was a Catholic. Ironically, it would have helped him to be more Catholic, right? Because if you think about the 2004 election, that was the election between the second election of George W. Bush, who was the Republican, and John Kerry, the Democrat. George Bush won that election with the support of Catholic voters who felt that John Kerry was a fake Catholic, that he was secularized and not sensitive to religious concerns and to the concerns of people of faith. Had John Kerry been a little bit more Catholic, maybe like 5% more, in 2004, he probably would be the president of the United States.
Yes, thank you very much for your stimulating talk. I'd like to come back to these sort of three topics that you presented. And it seems, of course, very obvious that there's a big difference between the persecution that is taking place and the immigration issue, and then something on a very sort of personal almost level, and almost sort of ignoring the social issues that might lead to an abortion. So I would like to sort of ask you what sort of political agenda, what sort of a real action is taking place in terms of the number one, the persecution issue, which seems to be on a completely different level in terms of also influencing foreign policy, and also in terms of immigration on that, the consequences in terms of political involvement. Thank you.
Well, you are right. I mean, these issues are all heterogeneous. They're quite diverse among themselves. And by the way, I didn't mean to suggest that those three represented an exclusive list of the Church's priorities. It's simply those are three areas in which I see the leadership of the Church in Europe and the United States coming closer together in terms of their basic outlook. But you asked on the anti-Christian persecution issue, what is being done? I think the simple answer to that question is not nearly enough. It is quite clear that although candidate Trump on the campaign trail and now President Trump has vowed to make the protection of persecuted Christians a foreign policy priority of his administration, even though President Putin of Russia has attempted to sort of style himself as a kind of Oriental Charlemagne, the new defender of the faith. Even though other leaders have from time to time given lip service to this issue, on the ground, very, very little has been done, and what has been done largely for military and strategic objectives that are only vaguely related to the interests of the minority population. Now, in church terms, I will give full credit both to the Holy See, the Vatican, and also to bishops in both Europe and the United States. Not only have they talked about this issue a great deal, done what they can, and at times more, to raise consciousness, it is also a fact, okay, and this is not like an anecdotal impression or a kind of guess. This is a hardcore empirical fact that as bad as the situation presently is for the Christian minority in Iraq and Syria, it would be infinitely worse had it not been for the engagement of Catholic organizations in partnership with bishops, both from the United States and Europe in those two countries. And here's the reason why. As you know, there is a fairly large pool of money flowing into Iraq and Syria in the form of humanitarian relief for ISIS victims. Okay, we're talking about in excess of $1 billion annually, because the needs are enormous. However, the logistics are that most of that aid is administered through the UN, which uses it to buy food or medicine, to hire doctors, to buy blankets, to do whatever, and then they are distributed through the major UN-operated refugee camps in places such as Erbil and so on. Now, the problem with that is Christians do not go to those camps because Christians fear that inside those camps, okay, the jihadists and the militants either have watchers there or in some cases are overtly the ones in charge. Okay? In other words, they do not feel safe in the camp. So Christians go to convents and they go to cathedrals. In the Middle East, virtually every cathedral, the courtyard of that cathedral today is a tent city, accommodating hundreds, if not thousands, of these Christian displaced persons and refugees. They go to Christian schools. They go to Christian clinics. This is where they take refuge. Absolutely no public money reaches those facilities. Had it not been for groups such as Catholic Relief Services, Aid to the Church in Need, the Knights of Columbus, Miserior Adveniat in Germany, had it not been for those groups, those people would have starved, they would have died of exposure to the cold, their children would not be in schools, they would have no medical treatment, it would be apocalyptic. And so I think the churches of the United States and Europe need to take real pride in the way that we have stepped up to try to plug that gap. But at the same time, we have got to hold the political class accountable because those resources are not infinite and they're going to need to be supplemented. And it's achievable if the political will is there to do it.
I was wondering if you could speak to climate change and the extent to be there's been a convergence between U.S. and European leadership on that, and what political price you think Trump will pay amongst Catholic voters for his stances.
Trying to guess what political price Trump is going to pay on anything is difficult these days. Look, the reason I didn't put climate change in my rundown of areas of convergence, I mean, you are right to put your finger on it. Because it is certainly the European bishops, I think, were there long before the mainstream of the American bishops were. But it is an issue where both of them, I think, largely would be in lockstep today. It's just I don't quite see the passion for that issue among many of the American bishops I do in these three other things. In other words, the commitment is there, the policy position is there, but it's one thing to have a position, it's another thing to pour your heart and soul into promoting that position. And that's where I don't think we quite are yet with the leadership class of the American church. Now, that said, the environment is, of course, another signature Pope Francis concern. When President Trump came calling on Pope Francis recently, on May 24th, the Holy Father presented him with a number of papal documents, but one of them was Laudato Si, his encyclical on the care of creation, first papal encyclical ever devoted entirely to that theme. So there clearly is an increasing emphasis on that, I think, beginning in Rome and radiating out. Now, you asked, what political price might President Trump face for ignoring it? Unfortunately, I think probably the most, fortunately, depending on perspective, but in any event, I think probably the most honest answer is very little. I mean, let us remember that last November, President Trump won a majority of the white Catholic vote in the United States. Now, he lost overwhelmingly among Hispanic Catholics and African American Catholics, but he won white Catholics it was very close, but it was about 51-49, somewhere in there. And it's not as if, by the way, last November, people weren't aware that there were some small tensions between the president and the Pope on a couple of things, okay? I mean, let us remember that Donald Trump became the first major party presidential candidate in American history ever to be publicly called out by a pope on the campaign trail, right? It was February. The Holy Father was in Mexico on the plane on the way back. Those of us who were in the press corps said, you came to Mexico and you talked about welcome and encounter and, bridges, not walls. But there is a presidential candidate in America who is proposing to build a wall where you just were a half hour ago. What do you think about that? And of course, famously, his answer was that man is not a Christian. Someone who wants to build bridges, not walls, is not a Christian. Unprecedented. Never happened before. So my point is, it is not as if that narrow majority of white Catholic voters who went into the ballot box in November didn't know, that there were tensions with the Pope. But I think the raw reality is that in the United States, like in most parts of the world, most Catholics are not carrying the social doctrine of the compendium of the social doctrine of the Catholic Church with them into the ballot box. They're voting their political ideology, not necessarily the Church's social teaching. Or to put it differently, they usually emphasize only those aspects of the Church's social teaching that support their political ideology, right? And they'll ignore the rest of it. I mean, this is the problem, really, with the fundamental physiognomy of American politics. I have said for years that if you are a serious Catholic in the United States, you are bound to end up politically homeless. You don't have a political home. Because we have one major party in the form of the Republicans who are often very good on the life issues, the dignity and the sacredness of human life, who foster a great respect for religious freedom, who take seriously the contributions of people of faith, and those are all marvelous things. Yet they tend to be disastrous on issues such as the economy, on war and peace, other forms of social justice, and of course the issue you raised, climate change. And with the Democrats, it's exactly the opposite, right? It is the classic problem of the square peg and the round hole, which means that Catholics in America are forever being forced to make these Faustian bargains, in terms of who they're going to vote for. But in any event, If the evidence of the last election is any indication, it would seem that the president's calculation is that at least on this issue, he can afford to be seen to be breaking with the Pope and not fundamentally jeopardize the coalition that put him into office in the first place.
By guidance of the schedule, we have time for a last question, and after that, we have time to discuss the whole thing in private in the break. So please, last question.
Yeah, in the back, go ahead. Oh, the gentleman in the back.
Okay, yeah. Thank you. Okay. How can the religious authorities cooperate in the Middle East?
How can religious communities cooperate in the Middle East? Well, you know what? I left my magic wand in the room upstairs. That is a question, of course, that some of the best minds, both in the worlds of religion and geopolitics, have been trying to get their minds around for a long time, and I certainly don't have a magic bullet solution. But I will say, I recently witnessed something, and I talked a little bit about this in our small group yesterday. I recently witnessed something that gave me some hope. I was on Pope Francis's recent trip to Egypt. And just to set the stage for you, that trip unfolded under the shadow of the bombing of 2 Coptic Christian churches in Egypt on Palm Sunday, just a week before the Pope arrived. In fact, there was some concern that the Pope's visit was going to be canceled for security reasons, but he insisted on going ahead. Those bombings left about 45 people dead and traumatized once again the Coptic Christian community in Egypt, in part because their Pope, Pope Tawadros, had been celebrating the Palm Sunday liturgy in one of the churches that was bombed. He was unharmed, but it was clearly an attempt on his life. And the broader context here is, and you don't need me to explain this to you, the Christian minority in Egypt is about 10% of the population. It's the largest Christian minority anywhere in the Middle East. And because Egypt has such a bellwether role in the Islamic world, it is such an Islamic powerhouse, therefore the fate of its Christians is both really but also symbolically important in terms of the prospects for religious freedom and tolerance and coexistence anywhere in the Middle East. Now, I will admit, there were those of us in advance of the Pope going to Egypt who were worried that he might be a little soft, that he might not really make the points that needed to be made, because he had spent so much time over the first 3 years of his papacy reaching out to Islam, trying to heal past wounds between Christianity and Islam. He had adopted the rhetoric of someone who is a great admirer of Islam. He will insist over and over that Islam is a religion of peace. He has in fact gone so far as to deny that there is such a thing as Islamic terrorism, on the grounds that terror is always a perversion of religion, never an expression of it. And that has made a real difference. I can tell you, moving in and out of countries with major Islamic populations, the word had kind of gotten out that Pope Francis likes us. He's a friend. Shortly before this trip to Egypt, I had been in Nigeria, which, of course, as you probably know, is the world's largest mixed Muslim-Christian nation, population of about 200 million evenly divided. And I was speaking with some imams who are on the board of the Grand National Mosque in Abuja. Just completely randomly, out of the blue. I didn't even ask the question. They said, we just want you to know, maybe you can get word to the Vatican, that we really like this Pope because it is obvious he is a friend of Islam. And while all of that is wonderful, some of us had been concerned that might get in the way of the Pope naming the scourge that is religious extremism and violence in the Middle East today. And it didn't. On the contrary, this was Francis the Hawk, not Francis the Dove. This was some of the strongest rhetoric on religious freedom that you will ever see. He stood in Al-Azhar which is the main mosque and university complex in Cairo. It's often called the Vatican of the Sunni Muslim world. It's its most prestigious center of learning. He stood there and called on religious leaders in the clerical establishment, by which he meant the Islamic clerical establishment of Egypt, called on them to unmask what he called the violence that masquerades as piety. He further said the only form of extremism acceptable to God is extremism in charity. Okay? And on and on. I mean, it was a tough speech. Then his next speech was with the political leadership of the country. He made many of the same points, including very pointedly calling for education intolerance among the young, which may sound banal to you, but in Egypt there is a ferocious political debate going on right now. President al-Sisi has called for a thorough reform of textbooks, school curricula, okay, to rid them of religious militancy. That call has been resisted by a number of clerical leaders in the country, including some of the clerics at Al-Azhar. So for the Pope to wade into that debate as directly as he did, okay, was seen as a very politically dicey and unforeseen thing to do. So it was a strong, strong, strong presentation. Now, what struck me is this. In 2011, so just, 6 years ago, okay, another pope sent a message to Egypt saying, you need to promote religious tolerance and you need to take better care of your Christians, after another set of bombings of Coptic churches. This was Pope Benedict XVI. It was the Christmas Day bombing of the Coptic Cathedral in Alexandria. The Holy Father wasn't in Egypt, but he dispatched a message to Egypt making those points: religious freedom, protection of Christians. Egypt went berserk. Okay, the government withcalled its ambassador from the Vatican and froze bilateral relations for a year. Al-Azhar suspended its own dialogue with the Vatican for 18 months. Benedict XVI was burned in effigy in the streets of Cairo by members of the Muslim Brotherhood. The media climate was overwhelmingly negative, and then President Mubarak went on national television to denounce this as an unacceptable act of interference. Okay? Now, flash forward 6 years later, a new pope does exactly the same thing, and he is treated like a conquering hero. Okay, this trip was saturation coverage in the Egyptian media while the Pope was there. It was overwhelmingly favorable. Okay, the reaction of the clerical establishment, I mean, I saw sheikhs and imam crying tears when they were hugging the Pope. Okay? The mood in the street was extremely upbeat about the Pope's message. It was essentially the Arabic version of "it's about damn time." And how do you explain that contrast? Okay. Well, I think part of it is simply that the situation on the ground in the Middle East has changed. I think Egyptians in particular today look at what has happened in Iraq and Syria and have no interest in it happening to them, and are therefore much more willing to embrace a kind of robust pushback against the fanatics and the extremists. But I also think Pope Francis, I think we did not give him enough credit. I think there was a kind of very cunning strategy at work here. I think he knew when he was elected 4 years ago that engaging Islam was going to be critically important. And I think he made the strategic decision that he would spend the early period of his papacy making it abundantly clear to the Muslim world that he is not a crusader, he is not a colonialist or an imperialist. He does not have any expansionary or proselytizing interests, that he is fundamentally a friend of the world, including a friend of the Islamic world. He wanted to make that so crystal clear and so undeniable that what it would do would be to put a lot of political capital in the bank. And I think now he realizes the moment has come to start spending it. Okay? So think about the lesson there. The question was, how can we promote cooperation among the religious communities in the Middle East. I don't know exactly what that looks like in practice, but here's what I do know. I think the first indispensable step is that we have to convince one another that we are friends. We have to build these zones of friendship, zones of trust. Because once those zones of friendship and trust exist, problems become manageable. Bombs are able to be diffused before they go off. Common solutions are much more thinkable. That, of course, is a long-term project. You have not decades, not centuries, but millennia, in some cases, of mutual suspicions that have to be rolled back. But I would suggest to you that the example of Pope Francis, and in particular the massive success of his recent foray into Egypt, suggests that in the right hands and the right heart, friendship can work miracles. Thank you.